Hence starting recording. Right. This week and next week, we are dealing with quite a key issue, which also has some preliminary keys. Certain doors, you kind of had a one key to open the top part and then another key to open the bottom part. So philosophically, this one has a couple of keys to really get involved with. Okay. So I think a lot of this week, we're going to get involved in the preliminary steps and then hopefully finish with a bit of a crescendo cliffhanger, if we can. And then next week, please God, we are going to, I guess, deal directly with the question. That's the plan, but we'll see how far we get. Okay, so the question is, why would God create a world? Okay, if you want it more pointed, why would an infinite God? Oh, very good background, Jonathan. Fantastic. Why would an infinite God create a finite world? Put a little bit different, if you like, is what has God got to get out of creating a world? Yeah? So those are just kind of different ways of saying the question, which is a really important question, but we're going to take 2 steps back and then 3 steps forward to try and tackle it properly. Okay, so the first thing is as follows. And it's a bit funny, but are we allowed to ask such a question? In other words, by nature, whenever you're talking about an infinite God, no one on this Zoom share is infinite, right?
Yeah.
Correct. Even those who have their screens off, right? Screens on, I can tell you for sure they're not infinite. Go on, Henry, what were you saying?
No, I just think that being finite as we are, we tend to think of everything else in the same way. We can't really conceive of the concept and to what it means to be infinite.
Correct,
So
100%.
we will try to give Hashem almost human characteristics of creating something because it's the sort of thing we would do to keep us occupied
Good. So just
to,
so
in a simplistic way.
yeah, so we're going to have to deal with all of that. Firstly, it's good to have a man who admits that they're not infinite. It's fantastic. Um, and,
I know my place.
you've been told to say all that, right? No, but secondly, you're right, and that.
After Pesach, I think my waistline feels pretty infinite.
Another story, Gideon.
And the truth is that the way Henry expressed it, that is the dilemma. That on the one hand, Hashem is infinite, yet he's created finite beings, and he clearly expects. We have to define what that means as well, but expects something of us. But yet, to relate to something, there has to be some form of compatibility or understanding. And if every time we try and understand, we press well, God's infinite, I'm finite, I don't really understand that button, then gone is the ability to relate whatsoever.
But could you say that he's created us in a finite way physically, if that's what we're talking about? But then I think perhaps there's a drop of an infinite touch in our minds. I feel like our minds are not restricted or finite in any way. Think of imagination. Perhaps that everything is still progressing in terms of our mind, where things are going.
Yeah. So the problem is whenever you say, well, that part is infinite, then you've more or less contradicted oneself in terms because a part can't be infinite. You know what I mean? Meaning, if a part means it's part of something, which means it's finite. You know what I mean? But yes, if you're saying I've created an extreme kind of chasm, you've got infinite here, finite here, and then you've got maybe something in the middle that can somehow connect to both. Yeah, that would work, right? That would work. But we got to.
Don't we say that part of us is godliness, and therefore that must be infinite, and that is a part of us. So how do we deal with the contradiction in that?
Yeah, the problem is you can't really say that part of us is infinite because there's only one thing that's infinite, and that's Hashem. Now you might want to say that Hashem invests something within us, or as Jonathan was saying, there's an ability to connect to him through our soul that's been can our soul is like the antenna of the infinite, right? But to say it is infinite, that basically means it's God, right? And Wells is very nice. We've got part.
Ironically, that entire answer froze on my. So I'm going to have to watch the recording to see what your answer was to my question.
No, I can say it very briefly. It's that if we have part of infinite, that means we're God, and part of infinite just can't be, right? Infinite is
Can we be?
thing.
But can we be part God? That's what he was saying, isn't it? About God created us in His image. Obviously, that can be a whole shiur in itself. But doesn't that mean that there is part of God in us?
So again, it can't be part in terms of infinite because infinite isn't really divisible. It can express itself. It can create things, which is the dilemma we're dealing with this week and next. But whenever you've got something that has firm borders and whatever, by nature you've gone into finite. Right? Now you might say, well, there's this mid-range thing that's not quite infinite, it's not quite finite. The problem is we don't really have terms. You're back to Henry's problem, don't really have terms to properly look at that. Okay. So
I think maybe just to expand this one more, just to clarify, it's like so obviously we live in a finite body, in a finite shell, but our mind is it is infinite in terms of, we can conjure up whole cities, universes, and characters and everything in our mind. There's no limitation to what our minds can think of. True, it is housed in something that is finite, but within the space of the mind and what it can think of, it is infinite.
Okay, good. So here we get to what does infinite mean? All right, and this is Henry problem. I'm going to do a couple of sentences on this, and then I want to get it. It's got to be a bit more practical because otherwise we're going to lose everyone, including ourselves, in an infinite world that we created. But it's like this. The word infinite really, it's funny, can mean at least three things, right? If I would tell you the universe is ever expanding, that wouldn't make the universe infinite, right? Because it's always got limits. It's just those are expanding, right? My children are also all expanding. And Gideon claimed after Pesach his waistline was as well. Maybe not forever expanding, right? But that doesn't make it infinite. That's just finite growing. Yeah. Then you've got things like, call it imagination or thought, which don't have clear limits, but they're not infinite in terms of them being beyond space and time. Right? That's kind of the mid-range infinite. And then you've got infinite in terms of God. That's totally out of space and time. Can't do anything. Everything existed before, afterwards, holds everything that works. You can't point to a part of. You can just at best point to an expression of. So what I want to do, I want to take this 3 steps much more practical. Okay, do you mind? Yeah, because I want to get to at least understanding our question, which is why would an infinite God create a finite world? Okay, so here's the dilemma. Expressed, I think, the nicest, if you don't mind, which is in mitzvot. On the one hand, God is infinite, and we're finite, as we've spoken about, and therefore there's got to be elements we can't understand. Yeah. On the other hand, there are mitzvot which say understand Hashem. We talk about emulating God. How often does the rabbi stand up and say like something like become godly or emulate God? In chesed, we emulate Hashem, and in helping other people and giving tzedakah, we emulate God, and in various in showing mercy, we emulate God. So if there's this kind of, well, he's infinite, I'm finite, there's nothing I can do about that. What's this emulate? You never can, right? What does that mean, right? I'm going to put it slightly differently. If we can't fully understand him, then what's learning Torah? And that also sounds a bit funny, right? What is learning? Learning Torah is understanding how Hashem relates to the world and how he works and his pathways. So if I can't understand him because he's infinite, I'm supposed to learn his Torah. Well, his Torah is also infinite, so to speak. So how do you put those two together?
Well, one could say for an infinite being, as Hashem is, each of the terms you've mentioned are simply one molecule of his infinity.
Right. So that's
we're just picking up just the tiniest portion of something from something.
Right. So then, yes, even to say part of or portion of infinity, that portion is not infinity, right? Because infinity means, right? The question is, can you apply, meaning you get something created by and tapping into. So let me try and do it the way the Sefer Ikrim explains it, and then we're going to go to Coca-Cola, if you don't mind. Yeah, that's the best way to ground this all. Yeah, so like this, the way the Sefer Ikrim. Oh, very good, Ellie. Ellie's got it there. I planted.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that.
Let's test. Now we're going to go to Johnny Walker. I just think what else you've got next to you. What's it called? So the way this Sefer Ikrim puts in, it's a really important categorization, which is like this. There's some things that are beyond our understanding of Hashem, right? And we know that because there are certain events in life, nationally or personally, that are inexplicable. You know, we don't understand them. Hashem does, he's got the plan and we don't. And that's what we're very happy to admit that, albeit often in painful times. Right? Pesach Seder night was a lot about that. He had the plan, we didn't, and we saw it come together. Right? And we're not always privy to see it come together, but there's a clear acknowledgement that that is so. He's infinite, we're finite, and we can only understand whatever. On the other hand, Hashem does allow us, it's very important, to understand some, I'm going to say the word part, only because there's really nothing else you can say, some parts of him. In other words, within Hashem, within understanding him, there's some bits that we can't understand, there's some bits that Hashem has allowed us to understand. Right? Hence, learning Torah, emulating him, etc. Right? And often the way we would say this is his essence is beyond understanding, right? But what he does and how he interacts with the world is subject to us understanding, and as Hashem allows us to understand that. Right? It's a bit like a teenager.
I thought we have to.
You can't really understand them,
talk,
but you can just about grasp what they do.
I thought we have to. We can't really talk about us understanding Hashem, even the bits He's allowed us. I thought that's why we talk about things like a taste and a sort of, a hint to. It's not really proper understanding, is it?
So again, you're talking about individual mitzvahs, right? Yeah. To an extent, there are going to be levels within mitzvahs as well, where Hashem has granted us access to some levels and not necessarily to other levels, and that's fine as well. Right, that's fine as well. But my point here is that Hashem purposefully, despite him being infinite, allowed us to access certain things of him. Right? And that has to be, because otherwise what we're doing studying Torah and what we're doing, we're kind of trying to emulate him, that has to be. Okay, with that, I want to move into our next realm of definition, which is, why would Hashem create a world? Now, the question is that question a question? Is that a legal question? You know what I mean? In other words, am I allowed to ask, why would Hashem create a world?
We can ask, I think we can ask anything, but we don't necessarily know that we'll understand the answer or that we'll get an answer. That's okay. I hear that. So let me rephrase the question then.
When you say a legal question, do you mean a question without sounding heretical?
Yeah, you could put it like that. I mean, is it a question that I can expect to answer? I'll put it like that.
Oh,
right. Am I allowed to asking why about Hashem? Is that like, what does that? Is that okay? Like, can we do that?
Yeah.
So this, by the way, is going to resurface because, please God, we're going to learn about free will, and that is one area of compatibility between us and Hashem. In other words, just like he has free will to do whatever he wants, he imbued us or invested within us free will for us to do whatever we want so that we can be compatible with him. That's one area of compatibility. It's going to come up again when we learn about why do bad things happen to good people. In other words, pathways of understanding why Hashem would versus can we really understand why he does. Right? So the best, I think, way this has once been explained to me is the Coca-Cola. Yeah. Other brands available. And that is the following. Yeah. It goes like this. So we drove past in fact, two on the way to where we are in Netanya at the moment. We drove past two bottle factories, believe it or not. Yeah. There was the Coca-Cola factory in Bnei Brak, on the outskirts of Bnei Brak, which always looks interesting, that I've never been in. I assume it's the bubble-filled and Israeli version of the Cadbury's World. But anyway, and then we went past another massive place on the way kind of into Netanya, which make bottles. Well, it makes bottles. Those gigantic, whatever. They seem to make bottles. Didn't walk in. All right, but that's that. Now, here we go. If I would ask you, why did the person create the bottle factory? Let's do it like that. Right? So you could say lots of things, right? Go on, Ellie.
To house the drinks.
Right? To house the drinks, right. So why does he want to do that?
To sell them. Bottles, and so he's going to provide the bottles and make a fortune.
That's okay, good. So to sell them, right? So you could say he wants to make money, right? You could say he wants to care for the environment and therefore create bottles that are somewhat reusable. Don't know. You could say he wants to provide people with jobs, right? You could say that. You could say that as a child, he was hit on the head with a bottle, and ever since, had this fascination with bottles and therefore wanted to create bottles for a living or something like that, right? It could be lots of things that we say. Yeah. And we can't really, and this is even like a finite being, right? Just going past a bottle factory without access to the owner, you can't really put your finger on it. Now, again, you can work out logical pathways, right? But putting your finger on it, you wouldn't be able to do. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. If I flip the question and say, right, now that the bottles are made, what should we do with them? That question is much easier to answer, right? Yeah. Because I'm not going back into the mind of the maker. I'm looking at the product and realizing what I can do with it. Right? Now, ideally, the two would go hand in hand because, if you buy an MP3 player and use it as a frisbee, then you might have had a lot of fun with it, but that's not what it was made for. Right? I mean, most people think so. My kids sometimes yes, sometimes no. But so ideally they would dovetail, meaning the purpose with which the bottles were created would be reflected and expressed in what you are doing with those bottles, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. In other words, if the bottles were created to give people jobs, ideally you would somehow use the bottles to give people further jobs down the line, whatever. Right? But in as much as we can't always know the purpose, so we go with what we have in front of us. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So the way it was explained to me is as follows. Asking why Hashem made the world, there's got to be part of that why which is inaccessible because it's Hashem and he's infinite. Right? We can look for logical pathways, and if we have sources, which we'll discuss next week, which tell us via tradition that God has revealed certain areas of why he created the world, then fantastic. All in. Right? But ultimately, if you're asking a why question, then often you're going to come up short. Right? If it's, however, right, God has done it, either looking back and saying what's the most logical reason, or given that now the world is here, much like the bottles are here, what do we do with them? Right? That's a question which we can access more freely, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we
Is that what Abraham did to discover God? Like he had the product. Sorry. Is that what Abraham did to discover God in the first place? He saw the world, he saw the leaves, he saw the trees, and worked out there has to be something for that. Is that what he did to discover God?
That's interesting. Meaning, did Abraham come to Hashem through purpose or through just observing that something must have made all this? The sources seem to say the latter more than the former. Interesting. Was there? I mean, he definitely did have access to certain areas of understanding mitzvahs through looking at the world, but it sounds like his initial journey to God was just, look, there's an amazing world that must have got here somehow, through some purposeful creator. Yeah. Okay. So again, in terms of defining the question, hopefully we made two elements of progress, right? Number one is that there's certain areas of Hashem, meaning Hashem's essence, that are slightly off limits, or fully off limits. But then there's the logical pathways in which he runs the world. Okay. Put in different terms, there's some bits that Hashem just inaccessible, and some things he allows us to understand. But even differently, right? We can't do the why when it comes to the bottle maker, right? But we can do the what. Yeah, we can do the what. And as we'll see towards the end of next week, even the whys that we can ask should hopefully be directed towards the whats. And what I mean by that is that Rav Dessler, who was kind of quite a big Jewish thinker, died in 1953, he used to tell his students, don't get over involved in philosophizing, even though he was fantastic at it, because it has to lead to action. And now this theory that's unrelated to practice is something that doesn't really live on too much. Yeah? Okay. So again, phase one is what we can and can't understand. Phase two is the bottles, purpose of bottles versus actually using the bottles now that we have them. Okay, well, I'll do one other thing which is related, because here's the place to do it, and then we're going to try and head towards defining our question a bit better and set it up, please God, nicely for next week. That's as follows. The spin-off issue is like this, ascribing feelings to Hashem. Yeah, you ever seen this before? Either feelings or human terms to Hashem.
But
Yeah, like a jealous
that's
God.
what we do.
But that's what we do, right? Go on,
We
like.
anthropomorphize.
Yes, we do. Go on, Gideon, what were you saying? Your example is?
Well, like it says in the Torah, like a jealous God. That's what it says things.
Exactly. So we have lots of them. Hashem's outstretched hand, Hashem being jealous, and we have a lot of these things, right? A lot of these things. So the phrase here that's used is Dibra Torah Koloshon B'nei Adam, which means the Torah explained things in human terms. It's quite a dangerous game, to be honest, right? But what it means is, in order for us to understand, on the basic level understand this, is in order for us to understand or relate to certain areas of Hashem, we get even areas a bit clumsy, but certain ways he interacts with us, we will say that Hashem is jealous of this, Hashem gets angry because of this. When we talk about Hashem being angry, it's not that he loses it, right? That's it. It doesn't work like that. Okay, but what it means is Hashem is acting in a way that we would perceive as anger. Even if it's pre-programmed into the world in terms of action and reaction. When you do X, this happens. For example, the Torah says if you misbehave, you'll get kicked out of the land. We would describe that, if it happens, as Hashem is angry at us. Right? That's just being pre-programmed into the fabric of creation. You do X, then Y happens. It's not that Hashem is sitting there losing it. Right? But again, it's Dibra Torah Koloshon B'nei Adam, it's the way we relate to Hashem, and it's an important way we relate to Hashem, but nevertheless, that doesn't touch Hashem's essence. That's why we have certain Gemaras, for example, that talk about Hashem's inner joy, irrespective of anything else that happens. Right? Again, ascribing emotions to Hashem, we have to just do that carefully, because we've got the bits that are his essence, they're untouchable, and then we've got what we would call his attributes, or the way he relates to the world, and that's a separate area. Okay, let's set ourselves up for next week, because we've been quite philosophical this week. I guess that's what the share is, but more than normal. And that goes as follows. So next week, we're going to finally ask the question, what is the purpose of the world being created? Why would Hashem do it? Right? Or now that it's here, what are those bottles? Yeah. So what I'm going to take you through, hopefully, is there is an immense contradiction about this. I'm trying to keep this as non-quoting a million sources as possible, but we've got a whole breadth, and I put this in that booklet on the group, a whole breadth of sources that say that Hashem created the world for his honor. All right? I have to work out what on earth that means, but we've got a whole breadth of sources, most famous of which, although they're all taken from a verse or two, we say in davening, and we like singing it on Simchat Torah, Baruch Hu Elokeinu Shebranu Lichvodo. Blessed is Hashem who created us for his honor. Yeah? Now, leaving out the philosophical difficulties with an infinite God needing honor, right? That there are various sources. Again, God created the world for his honor. Okay.
It's interesting. We just read about that in the Pesach story, where it talks about the Pharaoh's chariots when they're coming out, that it was for God's honor.
Yeah, all of that, 100%. We'll find that theme very much repeated. Yeah, 100%. Good shout. Now, then we've got the sources that say that God created the world to give us good. In other words, God is essentially good, and essentially good means giving good to others. And giving good to others from an essentially good being means giving good that is like this essentially good being. I'm going to do all this next week, don't worry. And therefore, he creates an arena where we can earn our goodness. That's called this world, right? Where we can earn reward. And it has to be earned, because otherwise it wouldn't be ours and we'd be embarrassed getting it as a free gift. And therefore, he created the world. The phrase is to give us pleasure. Now, not pleasure in this world, but a way to earn our pleasure in the next world. Right? Pleasure closest to God, whatever synonym you'd like. Okay, that's a very, very different take on purpose of the world. The first approach said it was for him, for his honor. Second approach said it was to give us a way of earning our reward. It's for us. Right? So next week, please God, we're going to try and look at how those two can go together. Okay, but suffice to say, to summarize this week, bits of God we can understand, bits of God we can't. Being careful in terms of ascribing human feelings or human parts to Hashem, and let the bottle parable forever remain etched in our memories. Hopefully. Fine. All right, good. We'll pick it up, please, go next week. That's the plan. We're going to tackle the question and kind of deal with these two elements, his honor and our pleasure. Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, see you, everyone. See you.
Thanks a lot.
Good to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.